Okay, here we go. So, on behalf of the Center for the National Interest and the Nuclear Energy and National Security Coalition, I welcome you, friends, colleagues, and associates, and of course, nuclear nerds, to the webinar on U.S. nuclear cooperation in an era of strategic competition. I'm Jay Tilden, your host and the executive director of NENSC, the Nuclear Energy and National Security Coalition, and I want to thank you all for attending. I also want to thank Chris Plotch, Liz Dalton, Caitlin Murphy, James Nisha Bori, and John Conlon for all the behind-the-scenes efforts to make this happen. This is a timely discussion on the implications of the U.S. ability to remain a major player in both the civil nuclear energy market and a leader in nonproliferation and nuclear security. This is also timely because we saw last week with the imminent yet still not happened transmittal of the 123 agreement to Congress, a broad range of reporting, both good and bad. And so what we're going to try to do here is lay some ground facts about 123 agreements and the very nature of the issues at hand. I am really happy to have distinguished experts in the field of nuclear nonproliferation and the international dimensions of the peaceful uses of nuclear technologies. And again, this is focusing a lot on what we call Section 123 or a 123 agreement within the Atomic Energy Act of 1954. The participants of this panel are the Honorable Daniel Poneman. I worked with Dan when he was the Deputy Secretary of Energy from 2009 to 2014. He was the CEO of Centrus from 2015 to 2023. He's also, of course, the co-chair on NENSC and a distinguished fellow at both the Atlantic Council and the Scowcroft Center. Also joining us is Honorable Ms. Corey Hinderstein. She's an expert in nonproliferation. Right now, she's currently the Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. When I worked with her very closely, she was the Deputy Administrator for the Defense Nuclear Nonproliferation within the Department of Energy's NNSA. And prior to that, she was a Vice President at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And last but certainly not least, my fellow co-sponsor and friend, Paul Saunders, the President and CEO for the Center for the National Interest. He has had decades of practice and experience at the center in the broad areas of foreign policy, security issues, and of course, U.S.-Russia relations. He was also a senior advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs in the Bush administration. So we'll start with a keynote from Dan Poneman. Then we will move to opening comments from our other panel members. Maybe we'll then have a few facilitated questions and answers, and then we'll open it up for questions that you should use in the chat room to get to us. So with that, Dan, over to you.
Thank you, Jay, and thank you for your leadership of the Nuclear Energy and National Security Coalition. I want to thank Paul Saunders, my good friend and colleague, for co-hosting this session, and Corey for her decades of thought leadership and public service. This is an important conversation at a critical moment. 80 years ago, the United States led the world in the discovery and exploitation of atomic fission through the Manhattan Project, unleashing the furies to end the Second World War. Over 70 years ago, President Eisenhower articulated the Atoms for Peace vision to address the inherent duality of atomic fission, with its prodigious potential to benefit humanity or to destroy it. The progeny of that vision included the International Atomic Energy Agency and its system of international safeguards to minimize the risk of the spread of nuclear weapons while promoting the spread of the benefits of the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Later, that system was codified and amplified through the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, which, since its entry into force in 1970, has become the most widely subscribed arms control treaty in the history of the world. For over 70 years, the nuclear navy, launched under the leadership of Admiral Hyman Rickover, has built and operated small nuclear reactors safely in over 200 ships and spun off a domestic nuclear industry that at its height operated 112 commercial reactors and has steadily generated about 1/5 of our nation's electricity. For decades, the United States was the unquestioned leader in nuclear technology for both civilian and military purposes. The steady demand by the Navy for nuclear-powered submarines and carriers, paired with the growing need for power to fuel America's economic growth, created a thriving domestic market that sustained and supported a robust supply chain of high-quality manufacturers and well-trained professionals. A healthy ecosystem developed between the Navy, which recruited and trained an amazing cadre of professionals who have run silent, run deep, and run safely for generations, and the commercial nuclear industry, which offered a reliable and rewarding future to Navy veterans. Both private capital and appropriated dollars supported a large and flourishing infrastructure of technology, training, and manufacturing that reduced costs for taxpayers and ratepayers alike, while ensuring high-quality reactors and operational excellence in both the commercial and naval fleets. Of course, a healthy domestic commercial industry can support a successful export program, and that's exactly what happened. Dozens of U.S. reactors were exported to other countries. Most reactors required enriched uranium fuel, and the United States dominated that market. And every one of those exports of reactors and fuels carried a little American flag with the strongest nonproliferation conditions of any major nuclear exporter. America's nuclear leadership in the global marketplace produced jobs and revenues, to be sure, but that's not all. Entering into a nuclear partnership is a century-long proposition between the planning, construction, operation, and decommissioning of a plant. It brought America influence, fostered lifelong relationships, and yes, leverage. But leverage to what end? I would submit that this leverage was critical to support U.S. nuclear safety standards and U.S. nonproliferation standards. And I would further submit that U.S. safety and nonproliferation standards were and remain second to none. And we use that leverage vigorously. In the interest of time and given the issues of the moment, I will focus only on the nonproliferation side of that equation. One has to recognize that by the 1970s, this U.S. dominance in nuclear exports was under serious challenge. So to get a leg up on the U.S., our competitors started offering dangerous fuel cycle capabilities to sweeten their offers. France agreed to build a plutonium reprocessing plant in Pakistan. Germany agreed to build a uranium enrichment plant and a plutonium reprocessing plant in Brazil. Meanwhile, India used reactor designs from Canada and heavy water from the United States to build and detonate a so-called peaceful nuclear device in 1974, underlining the need to strengthen nonproliferation controls over technology transferred for ostensibly peaceful purposes. So how did the United States respond? Diplomatically, the United States convened key supplier nations into what was initially called the London Suppliers Club, and later was expanded and formalized into the Nuclear Suppliers Group to agree on guidelines for responsible export behavior to prevent diversion of peaceful nuclear exports to military purposes. First things first, they killed the fuel cycle deals with Pakistan and Brazil. Legislatively, the U.S. Congress significantly tightened the nonproliferation conditions set forth in the Atomic Energy Act of 1954 and required in all of the now famous 123 agreements for peaceful nuclear cooperation. These added conditions, including requirements for full-scope safeguards, prior consent over enrichment and reprocessing, nonproliferation impact statements, etc., were, according to my AI inquiry last evening, quote, significantly stricter, more legally rigid, and more politically intrusive, close quote, than those required by any of the other major reactor exporters, Russia, China, France, Korea, and Japan. Although the term itself makes me cringe, one might almost call the 1978 law the gold standard of nonproliferation controls. So how did the United States prevent our unilateral ratcheting up of our nonproliferation controls from killing our competitive prospects to sell reactors? Through a quarter century of arduous diplomacy, through the Nuclear Suppliers Group and other diplomatic efforts to persuade other suppliers to ratchet up theirs. And we made significant progress in doing so. But we faced another problem. The U.S. nuclear industry was atrophying. The 1979 Three Mile Island accident, although it caused no fatalities, devastated American confidence in nuclear energy. It did not help that the accident happened less than 2 weeks after the release of the China Syndrome. And so after that, not a single reactor for many, many years was ordered in the United States. Over 50 nuclear power plant projects were canceled, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission did not issue another construction permit until 2012. Then we allowed our uranium enrichment industry to atrophy. In the 1990s, the United States became the only country ever to privatize the bomb making technology known as uranium enrichment. The story is too complicated to tell here, but suffice it to say that after the Fukushima accident clobbered the nuclear fuel market, the state owned uranium enrichment enterprises in Russia, China, and Europe all survived, but the privatized US company went bankrupt. So when I started working on nonproliferation for President Bush 41, the United States had 85% of the global uranium enrichment market. And by the time I served as Deputy Secretary of Energy at the time of Fukushima, we were down to zero US enrichment capacity based on US technology. Meanwhile, our competitors gobbled up market share. Russia now boasts a reactor order book of $200 billion. The US order book at this moment is less than $8 billion, although, of course, we have hopes that that will grow. Russia now controls around 45% of the global uranium enrichment market. China has built 37 reactors in the last 10 years. The United States has built 3 reactors in the last 30 years. And when it comes to Europe, Europe now controls 80% of the US enrichment market, while its Corfu Declaration requires that Europe keep 80% of its own enrichment market for its own suppliers. The rest goes to Russia. I'm not whining. I'm not criticizing the idea of robust competition. I have the highest regard for many of our competitors, although I do not endorse all of their practices. But we must face facts. No exports means no influence. If we don't recover the global leadership that we once enjoyed, you can forget about U.S. nonproliferation conditions shaping our collective nuclear future. We won't even have a seat at the table. How do we regain our global leadership? It starts at home. We need to revitalize our own nuclear industry. And here's good news. Vogtle 3 and 4 got built. Overdue and over budget, to be sure, but what could you expect after 30 years of a collapsing supply chain and talent pool? After 20 years of flat demand, electricity demand is now skyrocketing because of the AI revolution. The hyperscalers that need massive amounts of electricity have capex budgets in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Bipartisan legislation has been passed to revive U.S. enrichment industry and streamline NRC regulations. And a suite of executive orders is driving a countrywide effort to deploy advanced small modular reactors, while the Department of Energy is providing over $17 billion to promote the sale of large current generation reactors. We have momentum. We have reactors. We're rebuilding our fuel supply, and we need nuclear exports for 2 reasons. First, that global market represents an incredible opportunity to support American energy, technology, and jobs. And second, we need nuclear exports to promote U.S. nonproliferation conditions around the world. And so we'll talk about it more, but that does bring us to at least think about Saudi Arabia. So does anybody actually believe that if the United States does not sell them reactors, that our competitors won't either? Does anyone believe that any of our competitors will insist on the full suite of statutory conditions required by U.S. Nonproliferation Act of 1978, much less some chimerical gold standard, which is not gold, not standard, not required by any other exporter, and not required by the Non-Proliferation Treaty? Having worked on the U.S. nonproliferation legislation in the 1970s and worked on the UAE and Saudi nuclear matters in years past, I can tell you that the whole phrase gold standard represents a gross misreading of history and may pose the greatest obstacle to the prospects of the U.S. sustaining the non-proliferation standards I believe that all of us on this call strongly desire. Time will not permit a full explanation, but for now, I would simply note that out of 26 123 agreements the United States has, this standard has only been applied in 2, the UAE and Taiwan, which is obviously a special case. And I will ask Jay to put an article, which I wrote years ago in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, to explain this in more detail. In closing, I'm just making 2 requests. First, let's face facts. The U.S. is struggling to regain its footing in an intensely competitive global nuclear market, and we do not have the leverage unilaterally to dictate terms and expect our competitors and customers simply to comply. If we have a rhetorically pure nonproliferation policy that has no adherence, then U.S. global influence will wane and U.S. nonproliferation standards will erode. Second, before we jump to conclusions, let's take the time to read the actual agreement when it is submitted to the Hill, study its term, and have a healthy and vigorous debate and discussion on the basis of the facts and not on the basis of speculation, which I think is a very good segue, Jay, back to you and to start the conversation. And so thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dan. That really gave a nice table setting, getting everyone level set on this, and also sobering in some of the challenges as well as the opportunities that we have facing us. So, with that, I'd like to turn to Corey Hinderstein. So, Corey, maybe you can build on that and give some of your own perspectives on this rather interesting and dynamic situation.
Sure. Thank you, Jay. And thank you to everyone, Paul, and your organizations for inviting me to be part of this. As your kind of one outsider here on the panel, I hope that I can contribute to the conversation and look forward to that back and forth. So I'm only going to start with a few short minutes of reflection. Um, I think that Dan gave a really important laydown on some of the history. And while I agree with him on a lot and may disagree on some nuances, which we can get to, I do think it's important to recognize that 123 agreements do serve many purposes. They do facilitate trade. They are a way of acknowledging and differentiating some of our partners and allies. They underpin investment decisions for US and other companies in how they are expecting or planning to play in a market. But they're also a national security document that plays a lot of different roles in that context, not least that it's part of our commitment as a nuclear weapons state under the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty to facilitate access to the peaceful benefits of nuclear energy. It is also our responsibility as a nuclear weapons state to do that in a way that continues to meet our obligations under the treaty, including our nonproliferation obligations. In recent weeks, for obvious reasons, I've gone back a couple of times to the original language of the Atomic Energy Act. Um, and it's worth noting because it starts with a declaration. And the declaration is a statement of US policy, which is a statement that, and I will read it, that says atomic energy is capable of application for peaceful as well as military purposes. It is therefore declared to be the policy of the United States that A, the development, use, and control of atomic energy shall be directed so as to make the maximum contribution to the general welfare, subject at all times to the paramount objective of making the maximum contribution to the common defense and security, and B, the development, use, and control of atomic energy shall be directed so as to promote world peace, improve the general welfare, increase the standard of living, and strengthen free cooperation in private enterprise. So there's a lot that's packed into that statement, that declaration statement. You heard this reflection of strategic competition, of economic competition, but of peace and the extrapolation of that to nonproliferation and nuclear security. And while the Atomic Energy Act has not been static, I mean, it's been amended dozens of times, not least through the establishment of the 1978 Nuclear Nonproliferation Act, that statement of declaration has stayed firm. And my intent in reading that and reflecting on this is not to get legalistic. I mean, I'm no more a lawyer than I am a physicist. But I do think it's important to recognize that these laws and the 123 agreements that are implemented according to their terms do and have reflected over decades changing priorities, evolved technical landscape, changed international legal environment, and reflections on the relative importance of those different purposes. So I look forward to the conversation about kind of how this proposed Saudi agreement fits in. And as a kind of dyed-in-the-wool nonproliferation person that, I've worked in this field for more than 30 years, you may be surprised to hear me say that I'm not fundamentally opposed to it. I think there are a lot of questions I still have, and I will wait until seeing the text. But I think that we have to remain smart and creative in recognizing how 123 agreements can serve US national security interest, which in the end is what they were designed to do, but also serving that general interest. And I'll maybe end with a little bit of an anecdote. When I was doing my Senate confirmation hearing to be deputy administrator at the National Nuclear Security Administration, One of the things that you get is a lot of questions in advance from the Hill, from the members of the committee, in this case, the Senate Armed Services Committee that was responsible for referring me for confirmation. And you get some draft language from the agency for which you're nominated that give you some ideas of how they might help you answer those questions. In the end, those questions are yours to answer, and it had to be my words and my positions that I would stand behind. And one of the questions was about nuclear energy in Saudi Arabia. And the proposed answer was to say the worst possible outcome would be for the United States to not sell to Saudi Arabia and for China or Russia to do it. And I amended my answer. The question is for the record, it could still be found. I haven't gone back and refreshed it, so I'm not going to quote it exactly. But my answer was basically the second worst worst outcome would be for the US not to sell and for Russia and China to do it instead. I think the worst would be for the United States to sell and have that technology used for a Saudi nuclear weapon. So, how we balance those two priorities is at the heart of how we think about nuclear cooperation. And in a country like Saudi Arabia, it gets a little bit more complicated, but that doesn't mean that it can't be managed in service of our national interest. Thank you, Jay.
Thank you, Corey. That was really good, and it shows the dimensionalities here of what we're talking about. And I think that was a great example at the very end there when you're in the hot seat and you have to actually make it your position because that's the job you're going into. So with that, maybe Paul, over to you, and let's hear some of your thoughts. I know you and I have chatted about this as well, so I'd love to hear it.
No, thank you very much, Jay, and very pleased to be co-sponsoring with NENSC, and Dan and Corey. Certainly thank you very much for taking part. I'll try to be very brief. I'm gonna repeat one thing that Corey said. I'm neither a nuclear engineer or physicist or lawyer, so. Actually, I'm also not a senior nuclear non-proliferation official. I think what I will try to do is just to say a few very simple things that seem to me quite straightforward. So, first of all, why do these 1, 2, 3 agreements matter? I think we've already heard sort of several answers to that. Corey was just touching at the end there on our national security, which certainly is a very important objective of the agreements. Dan mentioned, the market opportunities and exports and jobs and all of those things, which are, certainly quite important for the United States. I would take that one a little bit further, actually, and say that, if we're really going to compete internationally and be successful in the nuclear industry, and there are a lot of reasons that I think that's important, then we also need to have an industry in the United States that has a certain scale and is able to drive down costs and build up good supply chains and all of the other things that firms need to be commercially competitive and successful. And I think it's pretty straightforward that the more markets we're competing in, the better we're going to be positioned to do that. Another thing I would say, which we didn't really touch on yet, is there are kind of some people who care about having sort of lower emissions rather than higher emissions from our power sector and also industrial sectors. I think it's important to be very mindful of that, and nuclear energy is a huge opportunity to push forward that agenda. Dan, I think, mentioned, the growing electricity demand, here in the US. And a lot of people, of course, have linked that to artificial intelligence and data centers. But, I personally, I think it really transcends that. We want to be electrifying a lot of different parts of our economy. We have some industries like actually the oil and gas industry that I think could benefit enormously from applications of nuclear power. There are things like desalination and that can help a lot domestically too. And we've got, huge parts. I mean, our economy is thankfully growing, and I think growing maybe more rapidly than some expected. Certainly, our electricity demand is growing more rapidly than some expected. But, the U.S. isn't the country in the world and isn't in the region of the world where the fastest economic growth is expected to happen in the future. And the fastest economic growth and the fastest growth in energy demand is going to happen, mostly in countries where we don't yet have these agreements. And I think that's something that we really need to think about. And then finally, Dan also mentioned in his really masterful opening comments, the strategic dimension of this and the decades-long partnerships that come out of cooperating on these issues, and those become very deep relationships, strategically and politically, and also just on a human level. If are we going to train all of the nuclear engineers of the future, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, in Saudi Arabia, and other places, or are they all going to go to, Nuclear Academy number 26? I'm making up the name, in Beijing. I think we need to think really long and hard about those kinds of questions. And these are some of the reasons that I think these agreements are so important. So I'll just end there.
Thanks so much, Paul. I really appreciate that, and I think everyone does as well. So, Dan, we convinced you to stay on, right? To move your calendar around and stay on for the panel. So I feel like it's only fitting that we come back to you now that you've heard your other two panelists, if you want to add anything or get into a dialogue.
I'll just make two comments of this and want to thank our colleagues again, one on each. I've known, well, both of them for a long time, but whenever Corey says she may disagree with me, I get nervous because she is very formidable. But I actually was relieved because where she ended, I think I could subscribe to that, right? Well, I subscribe to the gist of her comments in the sense that it's not a question of what, it's a question of how, right? And if we're thoughtful and careful and assiduous and pay attention to our statutory, not to say our moral obligations under the Atomic Energy Act and the Atoms for Peace vision, we're smart enough to do this. We can figure this out, right? If it turned out inadvertently that through folly or misadventure or neglect, we actually facilitated the thing we're trying to prevent, that would be a worse outcome. And this is not theoretical. It's India, May 1974. We provided the heavy water. I was a summer intern when Henry Kissinger was forced to admit in the Joint Committee on Atomic Energy that which no one wanted to admit, which is we were actually complicit. And that was what led to the totally appropriate ratcheting up of non-proliferation controls. So that's on Corey's. On Paul's excellent laydown, this last point that he made is really important. In coming out of the COP, Conference of Parties process, we now have 38 governments that have pledged to triple nuclear energy in their countries. And while we're all talking about data centers here, 90% of the energy and electricity demand growth globally is not from data centers. it's from air conditioning, it's from transportation. And there's one continent that will have a higher percentage of global population in 2050 than today, and that's Africa. 600 million Africans lack reliable access to electricity. I was with a nuclear leader from Africa at the Munich Security Conference a couple of years ago. He's got 2 cell phones. He's got Rafael Grossi from the International Atomic Energy Agency saying, come to the nuclear summit in Brussels. And he has the head of the Russian program. He puts on the phone and says, what do you want me to do? Where are you guys? I'm sending hundreds of students to China and Russia. And to Paul's point, they come back with relationships, with friendships, with language skills. Do we want non-proliferation rules written in Chinese and Russian? I don't. So there's a huge opportunity, but there's a huge vulnerability. The Russians and the Chinese are all over this, and they are all over Africa, and they're all over the emerging markets. We cannot beat, gun in it with a knife, right? And we've got to, and so that's why some of the things in terms of getting better financing out of Exim Bank and the Development Finance Corporation are important, but it's also making ourselves available. My view, just the last thing I'll say here is we got into this, I think, misperception that we still thought like King Lear, that we were everything, that we were ague proof, and that we were in a position to say it'll be thus and it'll be thus and so. And we're just not anymore. It's just not the reality in which we live. So we have to be good partners. We have to have people want to work with us. And so I would say, do the right kind of 123 agreement. It's automatically got all the non-proliferation conditions from the Non-Proliferation Act of 1978. And then once we're in a relationship, then we can do the smart things that I think Corey could help us design in terms of how to make sure that if we are engaged in nuclear cooperation with a country that we are having some concerns about, that we put the proper kind of guards, dogs, seals, lights, accounting, and so forth, so that we can do so safely, but not just see the field of battle on some, cross of gold, not to get too hung up on metaphors.
Thanks, Dan. That was really good. So maybe I can go back to, we'll start with Corey, and then we'll go to Paul, and then end with Dan again. But for some in the audience, they may not truly understand the timelines and the multi-layers that Corey, you and both Dan really hit on this, and then Paul, you wrapped it up with it's not just a commercial kind of a sales agreement, and it's not just a non-proliferation thing, right? And also there are some real altruistic pieces to this. If we're talking about concerns with changes in climate and carbon, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch that wrapped in. And then lastly, altogether, that forms this kind of a strategic relationship that lasts from 30 to whatever years. So if we can maybe talk a little about that, because that is all about I believe, how we figure out the risk acceptance of each tailored agreement. So Corey, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think 30 is on the short side. I mean, these could be 100-year relationships. We already have relationships verging on, 60, 70 years that date back to the beginning of our nuclear bilateral relationships. I think that part of the challenge here is this point of leverage. And this is where I disagree with Dan just a little bit, which is I think our strongest point of leverage is at the beginning. It is the beginning of these conversations for 2 key reasons. Because people still want relationships with the United States, and because people really respect US technology and the US regulatory process that underpins that technology. When I think about gold standard, I think less about the constellation of kind of restrictions and requirements. I think about our actual regulatory underpinning. That's the gold standard in the world, is the NRC stamp of approval. And so because countries want to deal with us and they want our technology, that's the time to ask for things. But it can't be the first time we have the conversation with a country. And this is something that I think is really important. You can't just go to a country that is seeking to solve very real problems, as Dan said, electrification, clean access to clean water, access to, these days, heating and air conditioning, climate remediation. These are in not just like human interest, but certainly national interest to support development. And those are issues of both law and equity. But we can't go to them and say, we're requiring something and you'll just have to take it. We have to start with a conversation about why what we are asking is A, relevant to them, B, important to them, their region, the world, and C, consistent with their interests in actually developing this technology. And I think the problem is when we think we can just walk into a room and throw something down on a table and that's the end of the conversation. It's disrespectful and frankly not credible. However, that we also have to recognize there are things we're not offering that our adversaries are. Russia offers spent fuel take back, even though, of course, they do require the countries to take back their high-level waste down the road. So it's not a pure offer, but it's still helpful. Other countries, including some of our allies, have a more economically integrated system with regard to their nuclear exports. So they can offer governmental assurances or loan support or favorable financing, et cetera, that we just can't offer because of the nature of our private sector. So having that holistic conversation and making sure that we understand that when a country is going to another potential supplier, it isn't always because of these quote unquote burdensome obligations as they get portrayed. A lot of times these are countries that agree with nuclear security, agree with nonproliferation, are good partners to the International Atomic Energy Agency. Those aren't the barriers. And we make them the scapegoats sometimes in a way that keeps us then, some people, from saying we shouldn't put that on the table because it's making the conversation harder. And I would argue that in a lot of cases, those aren't the things making the conversation harder. It's some of these other elements. So I think to kind of wrap up in 2 points. One is having a very clear idea of where and when our leverage can happen and how we have those conversations in a truly respectful, engaged and a true conversation, not a diktat. And then the second is recognizing where these things that we might ask that are good in our view on national security, non-proliferation, and nuclear security, where those really might be a sticking point and we need to get creative, and where it's actually maybe something else, something a little bit more systemic and something a little bit harder to grapple with. That's really the problem.
Thanks, Corey. That's some good thoughts. And I want to recap on one that you mentioned that just kind of got into my little T-Rex head here. It is the idea. So, Dan, you mentioned like 600 million Africans that are in need of, steady electricity and, the things that we all take for granted here in the US, et cetera. And the idea that you can't just start a relationship cold and jump into a nuclear thing, right? I mean, you have a whole range of what's the safety environment, like the safety culture of the country. What is the regulatory framework? I mean, let alone then you get into nonproliferation. I think that was really something that just shows that we do have a lot of work ahead of us on that. Paul, did you want to add anything to this as well?
I guess I might add a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I think that, Corey certainly is right that, these agreements are first of all, the agreements are multifaceted. And this isn't the only issue, and there are other considerations, and there are other areas, where our competitors kind of have advantages that we can't, or at least don't yet match. I certainly would agree with that. I think, that's a kind of a good reason for us to think hard about what further we can do in some of those other areas. Absolutely. I do think it's also a reason to be kind of sensitive to what else we're asking for because, it's part of a deal. I think we also have to recognize that, precisely because we've already talked about, these are strategic relationships. It's not just an economic matter that we're talking about. It's a security issue and it's a strategic issue. So, if we're talking about governments that have security concerns, and we're kind of worried about things that they might do in response to their security concerns. Then we also need to think about other ways that we can help them to address their security concerns. And I think that kind of has to be part of a responsible policy. Where I maybe disagree a little bit with Corey and am sort of more maybe aligned with Dan is around, the question of leverage and kind of where and when and how we have leverage during this process. And, that's not to say, I mean, look, we have a lot of leverage at the beginning, and it's always sort of the best to bring things up at the beginning, absolutely. But let's kind of do a thought experiment, and let's sort of take Saudi Arabia out of the picture and just do a thought experiment that there's a country that we're considering having a 1, 2, 3 agreement with, and that country actually is determined to have a nuclear weapon. It's a decision that they are have already made or are very close to making internally inside their own government, and they're keeping that from us. So in that scenario, which I think is kind of like the worst case scenario, right? For a country that we might deal with. Is it better for the United States to be a partner of that country on civil nuclear energy? To have agreements that put in force, all of the conditions that are in effect in our law. Dan mentioned the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act and all these other things, and maybe we can even do a little bit better than that. Is it better for us, to insist on conditions that government kind of won't accept, and to have them go somewhere else and get that technology, and then we kind of have zero leverage. And just to explain where I'm coming from, I'm a realist and a pragmatist, okay? And a Center for the National Interest, right? So I don't take the view that problems like proliferation or terrorism or security or any of those other things, they can never be solved. They're never permanently solved. They're managed. And in the case of non-proliferation, I would argue historically, a lot of our management of non-proliferation and prevention of proliferation has been built not around the idea actually or the kind of process of permanently preventing something, but of pushing it into the future and giving ourselves more time to work the problem in different ways, and kind of hoping that conditions will change or will build up leverage in other ways. So what I'm saying actually, sort of through this thought experiment is that actually I think if we're dealing with a country that's in that situation, we're actually going to be better off having a relationship with them, having visibility into what they're doing, having deep engagement in some of what they're doing, and having the kind of commercial and strategic and other kinds of leverage that derive from having them, dependent on our technology and dependent on, other things that the United States is kind of bringing to the table versus not being in that situation. So that may be sort of a provocative argument, to make. But I'll throw it out there, and would kind of, welcome others' comments.
May,
Thanks.
may I come in on that?
Sure. Real
You
quick, Dan, before you do, I do
know,
want to remind our audience out there to please, if you have questions, put it in the chat, and we're going to start getting to those. Go ahead, Dan.
yeah. So on each of these last two comments, and I'll start with a more recent poll. We actually, it's not a pure thought experiment. We have the case of North Korea, and to Paul's point about managing, not solving the problem, I used to say when I was in government to my colleagues, you don't buy nonproliferation, you rent it. And I was part of the team that negotiated the agreed framework. 1994, we stopped their plutonium program for 8 years. It blew up and we walked away. And when I was back in government, not to get into inside baseball, but there was a strong view you can't deal with them. They always cheat. And therefore, we're just going to ignore it. And I said, look, this is a mistake, right? Because when they were frozen in North Korea, we could do that. But when they're not frozen, every day we're not stopping them. They're getting more fissile material, they're getting more leverage, and the world is inured a little bit more to them being a so called nuclear weapon state. So we lose. If we are in there in some form or fashion, we got to make sure. I'm going to stick to Corey's point about we can't facilitate for crying out loud, but we have eyes on the issue. I mean, it's not trivial to be in a society and in a system. That's very helpful, Jay. From your past, right? So I think the thought experiment would suggest that having sort of done the Pontius Pilate thing on North Korea ended up with more bombs in North Korea than otherwise would have been the case. Now, on this thing about the arc of leverage, is really interesting, and I think there's common ground to find here. There's a Venn diagram. So our first conversations should be, let's train your people. Our first conversations should be, we have great safety standards. Let's help you set up a regulator. We've done this in the past. We should be creating a bandwidth so they want to work with us. And it may be, I don't know if it's, 10 months in or 2 years, but somewhere after we have established some kind of, oh yeah, and they've heard from Corey or her counterparts, look at this great technology, look at these great standards, then they want to be our partners. And then we do have some leverage, and that's when we should use it. We should be respectful. And sometimes we're not. And sometimes we do exactly what Corey has said we ought not to do, which is you go in there and you slap that thing on the table and go, that's it. I know because I was instructed to do this in the past. It didn't work very well. So let me just say one small thing about history. And I think it's important, especially with this debate that's going on about UAE standards and Saudi. The Emiratis developed their own policy. They had a white paper. They were looking at taking either big coal plant investments or nuclear. They knew they lived in a dangerous neighborhood. They said, look, we don't want to scare everybody. We're going to say we're going to rely on commercial markets. We're not going to build our own enrichment and reprocessing. They put it into their own law. But what's the comedy guy says, but no, we couldn't leave it there. We had to take a sovereign, independent decision taking mindfully and pridefully by that country. And we had to ratchet into a legally binding framework that we could then brag about. And we did foolishly brag about. We made up this foolish statement about a gold standard. Well, once you do that, who's ever going to sign another one of those? I mean, I had to go to Saudi Arabia and give this thing to them and go, well, why did you do that? Now you've just given this to the foreign ministry. I'm never going to see it again. So we have to be thoughtful about, Robert Burns, the poet, said, oh, want some power, the gift he gives to see ourselves as others see us. We have to be mindful of that. And to Corey's point, we have to be respectful. If we do these things, then our virtues can come through, and then we can have leverage, and then we can do good and do well. We can do well by our industry, and we can do well by nonproliferation.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah. So just, me just listening in on some of this stuff, I totally agree. Corey, you were spot on about bringing up this good debate about the point of leverage, right? And ultimately, we can't be, so to quote you, Dan, we can't be back when we were the only players in town and here it is, take it or leave it, because guess what? They can leave it. Conversely, we also just can't be so desperate to take it that we actually compromise, right? And it does then come down to that whole nature of the strategic relationship with the country and where we think they're going. So I bring that up because one of the questions we had in there talked about deterrence, about the US deterrence. And ultimately, right, we can talk about not just KSA, but also we can talk about other countries and how they actually not only rely upon us from a defense standpoint, right, national security, let alone commercial. Does does this element of national power called U.S. nuclear cooperation begin to fold into this idea of extended kind of deterrence? And I don't just mean nuclear weapons deterrence. I just mean deterrence writ large, that connection with the U.S. with the country. And what are your kind of thoughts on that?
Do you want me to kick off, Jay? Sure. So just a couple things here. I mean, first of all, I do think that U.S. extended deterrence has been one of the strongest and probably most undersung elements of nonproliferation policy throughout the nuclear age. I think that when you look at the history of countries that have at least investigated at some level nuclear weapons and the contribution nuclear weapons might make to their security, um, those who have been in a position to avail themselves of a U.S. nuclear umbrella have seen for a long time that that's a better option for them. Not just a more secure option, but frankly, more economical. Like, I mean, nuclear weapons programs are really expensive and invite the kind of not just scrutiny, but potentially intervention that most countries don't seek. And I do think that it's not a coincidence that we've started to see so-called allied proliferation become more of a conversation in the last few years and really bubbling up as these countries ask questions about whether they can rely on US extended deterrence at all. So do I think Germany or Poland are about to go nuclear? I don't. But do I think that there are real conversations about the extent to which they need to, when facing a very real Russian threat in Europe, um, how they need to think about their long-term existential risk. And if deterrence, the broader, as you say, not just extended nuclear deterrence, but the broader strategic relationship with the United States is undermined or questioned, I think it will lead to more countries not going nuclear per se, but hedging. And we're seeing this in East Asia as well with the China threat. And this is where the intersection with 123 agreements actually come in. Is it's not about because Paul, with respect to your, kind of theoretical case, if a country's really decided to go nuclear, we are beyond the Rubicon on 123 agreements and their relevance in my mind. We're now bringing in like bigger guns when it comes to pressure from the United States. But where it comes to a country who says, I'm not sure what decision I might need to make in like 5 years or 10 years. I don't know what decision I'm going to make, and I don't want to start that program when I have an urgent existential risk to manage. So I'm going to engage to the broadest extent possible on US or other, nuclear cooperation to kind of get the pieces in place. And so I like to describe it as like mise en place of people who watch cooking shows, right? So they're not making a taco yet, but they might want to have like chopped tomatoes over here and chopped onions over here, and they've already sauteed their meat over here, and they're ready to, and so they've got all the pieces in place. And that can be a really difficult thing for the United States to manage because, as Diane pointed out, under the NPT and a lot of other arrangements, we don't draw bright lines about what technologies countries are allowed to have. And so those kinds of conversations invite much more serious discussion. And I think that those conversations are very relevant to confidence in the United States strategic posture and the ability and interest of the United States in spending some of its own political, military, and security capital in protecting our partners and allies.
Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah. So first of all, I agree actually 100% with everything that Corey just said. I mean, like literally 100%. And just to clarify what I was saying in my thought experiment, my thought experiment was about a government that had decided to do that, but didn't tell us. But because obviously we wouldn't be able to move forward if we knew that or understood that. So I'm talking about the logic was that we didn't know that they wanted to do it. I agree completely with all of the points about kind of allied proliferation and the extent to which others think they can count on us. And I would kind of take it a little bit further, honestly, and say that anybody who has doubts about our willingness to send our soldiers to defend them would have to have 10 times as many doubts about our willingness to risk a nuclear attack on the United States of America. In order to defend them. And I think this is a tough dynamic that we're going to have to contend with. Let me, though, I want to, if it's okay, Jay, kind of to pivot just to say one other short thing about these 1, 2, 3 agreements, because I know we're getting kind of close to time, but I can also wait because I'm supposed to speak last anyway, if you prefer. I defer to you.
Why don't you go ahead and finish that up, and then we'll
All
go
right.
ahead and then pivot to the kind of the
So,
closing.
so just super briefly on 1, 2, 3 agreements generally, and this again is sort of more of a philosophical point. The Atomic Energy Act, I think if I remember correctly, was passed in 1954. That was 72 years ago. We have been negotiating 1, 2, 3 agreements since that time. We have about 50 of them, plus or minus. I would kind of submit that we've already done all of the easy ones. And to the extent that we want to be competing with China and Russia, and that's really a serious objective of American policy, we should kind of be honest with ourselves that every one of these agreements that we sign from this moment onward is going to be a hard agreement to sign. And we should also acknowledge to ourselves to negotiate and sign, sorry, to be more precise. And we should also kind of acknowledge to ourselves that if we decide to stay at 50 agreements, plus or minus, and only to do the ones that are easy, then we're going to be competing with South Korea and France and others like to sell the next nuclear reactor in Romania or whatever. And that's great. And I absolutely want American companies to do that. But there are 140 other countries in the world, and we're not going to be competing there. And China and Russia are going to be the only ones there. And actually, I would kind of submit that at a certain point, China is going to eat up the Russian export business, and it's kind of really just going to be China that's doing that. And I think that's a terrible outcome for the United States of America.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I totally agree. Yeah, there's a whole dimension here that we're just out of time on about the national industrial policy implications of this and how to balance the domestic builds and the foreign builds, and how the foreign builds are actually going to help the domestic builds and vice versa, let alone the supply chains and all that. But truly a great discussion. So, Paul, do you have other closing comments that you wanted to throw in?
Oh, I'm not sure that I would have a lot to add, and I certainly had enough to say already. I mean, I would really just want to thank you, Jay, and all your colleagues for the hard organizational work of putting the session together, and also very much Dan and Corey for just very I mean, to my mind, this is like the kind of what we should all really strive for in our policy debates here in Washington. I think this was a very kind of thoughtful, substantive discussion. I'm really grateful to Dan and to Corey for taking part. So thank you both.
Great. Thanks, Paul. So, look, I'll open it up. Corey, any last minute parting shots, and we'll end with Dan and then wrap it up.
No, I don't think anything else. Just add my appreciation to the full team. Thank you, Jay.
Great. Thanks, Corey. Dan, any last words?
Can't resist just saying we got into the weeds a lot, which is why we have this great opportunity with this webinar. Step back. This is an incredible moment of opportunity. We lost our lead. What's that movie? We lost our group. It's right there in front of us. We are on the market. We have momentum. And if we're smart about it, we can have it all. We can have all of the economic leverage and benefits, and we can have the best non-proliferation conditions in the world. We just have to be thoughtful and realistic. I think the conversation that you have curated here addresses some of these issues, but I want people to leave here with an optimistic sense that we have the building blocks in place. We got the technology, we've got the safety standards, we've got the non-proliferation standards, we've got the country people want to be with and not be under the thrall of the Russians and the Chinese. But we just have to be thoughtful and prudent about how we exercise this extraordinary moment so that we take full advantage of it, because we may never pass this way again.
Great, Dan. Thanks for that last. Yeah, I was going to say, we are at this unique time. And I know that there are dimensions here that scare people, right? I mean, we haven't even talked about the whole AI and WMD implications and nuclear, right? But we are in this golden era, good and bad, of nuclear, and we cannot allow this to pass. We need to be thoughtful, but we also need to not vapor lock on decisions, right? We have to be able to have thoughtful debate and move forward. So whether or not we're building AP-1000s outside of Warsaw, Poland, or we're building them outside of Warsaw, Virginia, it needs to happen. It needs to happen for many reasons. We just got to do it right. So with that, I will thank you all. I want to thank everyone who was out there in virtual land. And with that, we'll sign off here. Thanks again and happy Friday.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.